Without further ado, though, I'm going to introduce Michael Icky, Rail Planning Services. Michael Icky has worked in the transport industry for over 50 years. Wow. And I've seen many, many changes, I'm sure, Michael, in a variety of senior positions in both government and private organisations. He has a degree in civil engineering, a graduate diploma in personnel management and industrial relations. That must have been a journey and a half, wow. Various diplomas and certificates, IV in training and assessment. He is a fellow of the Institute of Engineers on the National Engineers Register and registered to practice as an engineer in Queensland and Victoria, and he's also a life member of the PWI. He's currently a director at Rail Planning Services and a lecturer at the University of Tasmania in rail engineering. I'd like to welcome Michael, you to the stage, and look forward to an amazing presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, for that great introduction. The topic I'm about to present on is called Doing Better with Less Embedded in Rail DNA, or for the more scientifically minded, deoxyribonucleic acid. First, the disclaimer. The views expressed in this presentation do not necessarily reflect the views of the Permanent Way Institution or my current and hopefully continued employer, Rail Planning Services. We'll take you on a journey. We'll look at some history of the railways going back a long way, a few issues, lessons learned from the Granville disaster, some signalling initiatives both locally in Spain, more recent history of railways in New South Wales, talk about a local rail project, some background to the current construction challenge, and training to meet the current challenge. Most major railways in Australia used to be government-owned. They were seen as an essential service in linking the country areas with major population centres and ports. In New South Wales, between 1857 and 1932, it was led by various Commissioner for Railways. From 1932 to 1972, the title changed to Chief Transport Commissioner. Not much change there. In October 1972, it became the Public Transport Commission, and the rate of organisational change increased dramatically from that date, and we'll have a closer look at that later in the presentation. The New South Wales Government Railways, as was then known, was often the largest employer in many country towns, and also one of the largest training organisations in the state. The New South Wales Government Railway was hopelessly underfunded for the tasks it was required to do. This chronic underfunding contributed significantly to the Granville disaster of January 1977, where 83 people tragically lost their lives and another 213 were injured. Evidence of that lack of funding was provided in a statement issued by the Chief Transport Commissioner, Neil McCusker, when he retired in 1972. He said, while the railways had to fund their own capital works, unlike roads, which got grants from federal and state governments, operate a passenger service that was not justified by either patronage or fair revenue, and accept a common carrier's obligation to carry any freight that was submitted for transport by rail, heavier deficits were inevitable. It was also evidenced by a statement signed by the 11 Division Engineers prior to the Granville disaster. The engineers stated that maintenance requirements needed for track and bridges have been severely increased as a result of staff freeze and non-approval of critical staff submissions. Track safety in some locations can no longer be guaranteed. This means that track failures will cause an increasing number of derailments. The Chief Civil Engineer was required to sign that the track was safe for train operation each year. After the letter from the Division Engineers, he refused to do so. The Chief Engineer, a mechanical engineer, signed off for the safety of the track. After Granville, he quietly resigned. None of that detail, nor the Division Engineer's letter, was released in the Royal Commission report. The Granville disaster forced significant positive changes to the railways in the following areas. Culture. The culture changed from a hierarchical military-style culture to one that was more collaborative and finally recognised the contributions that could be made by the field staff. New technology was introduced with resilient fastings and designs for track plates in turnouts. Training changed. Methods were broadened to allow for oral examinations for staff with English as a second language. Training documentation was revised and more practical training was performed under field supervision. Track inspection, asset management. Procedures were revised to incorporate positive reporting and better guidance for field staff performing that task. The better documentation led to planned maintenance rather than fix when broken, and field staff were supplied with tools to assist their tasks. More details can be found in the paper Granville, The Untold Story, available in the Rail Knowledge Bank. As a track engineer, you can imagine how it pains me to say that signal engineers are a shining example of doing better with less. In the period of underfunding, the signal engineers were the discipline that suffered the most from underfunding. Last century, some of us like Steve and myself can remember that, it was not uncommon to remove an old section of rusty 60-pound rail and leave it in the rail corridor to be later collected for scrap. However, when you came to recover the scrap rail, it would be gone. If you walked a little further, you would find it had been planted vertically in the ground and had grown telephone cables and an extra 50 years of asset life. The signal engineers practiced recycling and asset management long before either term became fashionable. It was not until the 1980s, when coincidentally a civil engineer was in charge of the signals branch, that the signals branch commenced to receive significant funding. The civil engineer briefed the State Rail Authority Board on the high probability of a wrong side failure due to the brittle nature of the existing vulcanised rubber signal cables. The cables had an asset life of 50 years. Many of the cables were 90 to 100 years old and had become very brittle. This meant that the rubber could break, the insulation fail, and the cables cross, causing a wrong side failure. That same civil engineer dutifully advised the board that having made them aware of this risk, they could now be found responsible if a wrong side failure occurred and they had not attempted to mitigate that risk. Miraculously, funding suddenly became available to commence replacing these life-expired cables. This is but one example of why funding decisions should be made by those responsible for the safety of the railways. In order to prepare this presentation, at great personal risk, I've managed to infiltrate one of the most powerful and clandestine organisations in the rail industry, the SSF, or as you may know them, the Secret Signals Fraternity. An excerpt from their Articles of Association reads as follows. The mission is to increase our power and influence through selling our skills and services at preposterous prices to ignorant customers. The SSF are very good at keeping their activities in the shadows, as the discussion of a near miss will show. A signal crew opened the door of a signal installation just as a track patrol walked past. The track staff stopped, looked into the virtually empty box, with their manager scratching his head and clearly wondering what was going on. The astute signal engineer quickly remarked that thieves had stolen all of the equipment. The track staff asked why there was no sign of forced entry to the installation. The signal engineer replied, "We all know that signalling equipment is terribly, terribly expensive, and the thieves had not wanted to inadvertently damage such valuable equipment." I by no means wish to diminish the numerous prestigious awards offered by various nations, Victoria Cross, US Congressional Gold Medal, France's Legion of Honour. The Secret Signals Fraternity had their own award, the Signal d'Or, the Golden Signal. The unnamed signal engineer, to protect her identity, received this award for their quick thinking and allowing the mystique of the signal fraternity to remain. The near miss also led to a change in base operating standards. So they changed so that several blinking LED lights were installed, a couple of printed circuits and a small fan so it would sound like something important was happening. Everyone knows that signal projects are terribly expensive. As Professor Julius Summer Miller used to say, why is this so? Some recent activities in Spain have provided some valuable insight into this question. The report from Spain's National Commission of Markets and Competition in October last year stated that in 2002 a signal cartel arose. It was formed by the two main companies in the market at the time, Alcatel, which was bought out by Thales in 2007, and Dimetronic, which was included as part of the Siemens acquisition of Invensys Rail in 2013. Alstom and Bombardier joined in 2014 and CAF Signalling in 2015. During that period, they won contracts worth $4.142 billion, some of those contracts lasting up to 2040. Fines for companies ranged from 30 million to 1.73 million euros. Fines for the directors ranged from 60,000 to 28,000 euros. No jail time was incurred. The fines represent just 3% of the tender value of the contracts. Since that time, the signals discipline has become more consolidated, with Hitachi purchasing Ansaldo in 2019 and Thales in 2021. This is an example of perhaps taking the theme of the conference, doing better profits with less competition, a little too far. We now come to more recent history in the railways, and on your screen are some of the rail organisations that have appeared in the last 42 years. But wait, there's more. And still more. That is 34 organisations in 42 years. Note the widespread use of acronyms. This is a common practice in the rail industry. As each reorganisation is designed to make it more efficient, it is difficult to imagine how further improvements can be made. Of course, after all, we now have 4 ministers to manage the portfolio. Some short-lived organisations were Infrastructure and Services for 3 months and the Railway Services Group for 5 months. In an unhappy coincidence, Infrastructure and Services came into existence at the same time as ISIS was running rampant and declaring an independent Arab state, another IAS. The human resource gurus realised that having your organisation confused with one that kidnapped people, brutally tortured them and then publicly beheaded them was not the type of image they were seeking. After all, we all know that HR would prefer to implement their staff reduction procedures much more discreetly. So IIS became Infrastructure in Place, which we have today. Railway Services Group. This reorganisation followed the usual well-worn process. Appoint a new CEO from outside the organisation, determine the vision and mission of the new organisation, develop a new organisation structure. Note this time there was no consultant report to indicate the theme for the restructure. Place people to acting positions until positions are advertised and filled, and start to determine who may not have a position in the new organisation so they could do some future career planning. Then we started all over again on another restructure. All above was achieved in 5 months while still running trains and maintaining infrastructure. However, Rail Services Group could be considered more productive than some other reorganisations because in that time we did produce a corporate tie. These are now a valuable collector's item. I mentioned earlier that railways were one of the largest training organisations. At one stage, over 100 apprentices and 10 graduate engineers were recruited annually. However, successive reorganisations meant the training role diminished as much work was given to private industry. The government view was that private industry would fill the training gap. I also mentioned that there was a long history of underfunding. This underfunding was interspersed with sporadic increases which usually lasted for only 3 to 5 years. This meant that the private industry had a choice of recruiting new staff and training them, only to find a short time later that the work for the additional staff had ceased. Alternatively, they could cherry-pick from the regular stream of competent and experienced staff who were released onto the market. Naturally, they made a commercial decision. Another example of signalling ingenuity. This time, this cabinet has real signalling equipment. The problem was that it was overheating in summer, causing failures. The signal engineer could not obtain components that could operate at higher temperatures, so he devised his own solution. He thought outside the box and purchased an industrial-size esky. Being a wise signal engineer, he also made sure it was secured. Problem solved. At this stage, I have to say that the stories circulating on social media that the signal engineer had to purchase the esky full of beer in order to get the esky are entirely false. They are probably started by the local track engineer who was disappointed he wasn't invited to share the beer. Another example of the signals fraternity's innovation is the introduction of moving block. This means that the fixed signals are no longer required and more trains could be moved through an existing rail corridor without having to build shiny new track, tunnels, viaducts and bridges. The accountants loved it. The track staff were in despair. After working collaboratively on turnouts and monitoring systems, how could our signal frenemies do this to us? This was taking the theme of doing better with less way too far. However, rail staff are resilient. In our darkest hour, we turn to perhaps an unusual source of inspiration. I speak, of course, of our very own whip-cracking former Prime Minister, Barnaby Joyce. After 697 days of isolation, the people in Western Australia may not have caught up to date with events on the East Coast. When Barnaby Joyce was Deputy Prime Minister the first time, he approved the Inland Rail project for an initial cost of $10 billion. The cost is for a rail line from Tottenham in Melbourne to Acacia Ridge in Brisbane. Proposed connections to the Melbourne and Brisbane ports will be completed by public-private partnerships. It is a coincidence that there are no National Party electorates in Brisbane or Melbourne. The Senate did a report on Inland Rail. Note the heading of the report, derailed from the start. They were concerned with the business case originally starting at $4.7 billion, $10 billion was announced, and projections that exceeding $20 billion, that maybe the business case wasn't quite as substantial as it should be. It is easy to be critical of large, complex and perhaps political projects. This project has been termed iconic. I prefer the term nation building, often used by that fabulous TV show, Utopia. To provide some balance to the Senate report, ARTC has outstanding community work being done in regional Australia by the Inland Rail Skills Academy in delivering skills and education programs. Narromine to Parkes section has been successfully upgraded and contracts have been let for the Narromine to Narrabri sections. Barnaby showed the civil staff that while the accountants control the budgets, it is often the politicians who make the decisions. That inspired the development of our secret weapon, the PPPO.
This tunnel boring machine will eventually leave here.
For those people delivering metros, a tunnel boring machine drilling into a station cavern becomes a fairly routine experience. However, a politician will view this event differently. Their hearts will beat faster. Their eyes will grow wide with excitement. Some have been even known to jump for joy. They will see a PPPO, a powerful public photo opportunity. Railway projects have suffered because they cannot normally be completed in an election cycle. A politician can announce a project at least once, often 2 to 4 times. They also have the shiny shovel moment. However, the opening of the project can be 1 or 2 election cycles later when the opposition could be in power. A metro solves this political problem. On the left-hand side, you see a normal railway project over the election cycles. On the right-hand side, you see all the extra powerful public photo opportunities delivered by a metro. A metro is the magic pudding of projects. The project just keeps on giving. No wonder every politician wants one. And for those politicians who cannot afford the necessary creative business case writers, they have to settle for a light rail project. A metro means construction of shiny new tracks, structures, tunnels and viaducts, so the civil and track staff are happy. New fleet, since driverless trains, so the rolling stock people happy. New electrical staff, infrastructure, so the electrical staff are happy. Moving block, so even the signals and control system staff are happy. New stations, platform doors and no timetables. Operations staff are very happy. A political bonus is there's no drivers complaining about safety issues. Peace and harmony has been restored to the rail industry. You hopefully now have some understanding as to why the transport industry has an issue on how to construct multiple projects with limited resources. While some may see achieving this mountain of work with limited resources as a difficult challenge, I see it as a great opportunity. After all, governments have been inadvertently training us over the last 50 years with continuous reorganisations and annual 5% dividends to doing better with less. At the start of this presentation, I mentioned 4 areas where there was a positive change on how railways operated as a result of the Granville disaster. The 4 areas were training, culture, technology, asset management. I had hoped to discuss the exciting developments occurring in those areas, but time does not permit. Once again, these same areas, slightly modified, are important points of focus for this challenge. None of these areas of focus are a magic bullet to solve this construction issue. However, I do see them as green shoots of optimism. If you combine them with the intellectual capacity available at this conference, they represent a powerful force for change, for doing more with less. As a former Prime Minister once said, life is not meant to be easy. However, that does not mean it cannot be bloody exciting. After all, on how many other projects could you start building a project and get to build an international speedway as well? Thank you for being such an attentive audience. I look forward to some spirited discussion with our esteemed Signal colleagues during the network session.